Hi there. Nice to talk to you again. Let me welcome you. Welcome to the next in the series, the next module in the series on this, excuse me, on this special certificate in environmental loss and investigation. For this module, the focus will be on blue laws. Okay. Now, before I talk about what is covered under blue laws, let me just summarize kung ano yung approach natin. Okay? It will not be that different from what we did under green laws. You might recall, how for each law I broke it out into 3 separate sections of discussion, just to kind of give a narrative, medyo a flow as to how we're gonna discuss and understand these laws. So ganun pa rin, I haven't really changed the approach. Hopefully it's working for you. But nonetheless, it's gonna be the same. Although ang mag-iiba lang siguro is that I will not be stopping to alert you of what I'm going to do. Basta gagawin ko na lang, just a flow. And I'm saying this because I'm sure, having done the 6 laws and the green laws, na nakita niyo na what the flow is, there won't be a necessity for me to, kind of alert you that we're going to be shifting from the rationale to what's being covered and eventually to sanctions. I think you know the flow already, so just for the benefit of time, I will no longer be stopping. No more hand-holding, so to speak. So I'll just go ahead and do it. Okay? So having said that, medyo magiging efficient tayong konti sa oras. And that also mean that medyo magiging short ang blue laws. And besides the fact that that's the approach I'm going to be taking, under blue laws, there's really only 2 laws that are covered. And because of that, we're going to get done sooner than we did with the green laws. Remember, the green laws, we had 6 laws. So anyway, ang pwedeng mangyari, I don't know if this is exactly what they're going to do. I guess we'll have to check with the administration. Pero I made a suggestion, and I don't know if they'll consider it, but the suggestion is to have the blue laws and the next module, which is the brown laws, be scheduled on the same day. So there's a chance that may happen. And it would only really make sense considering that sabi nga natin, blue laws only has 2 laws, whereas brown laws, no, if I'm not mistaken, I think there's 3 laws under that. So between blue laws and brown laws, that's 5 laws. Whereas green laws, by itself, isang module na yun had 6 laws. So, medyo maraming na-cover sa green laws. We had to try and be efficient about. And for blue laws, there's really only 2 laws. Plus, we're going to be medyo moving faster since there's no more giving heads up on what's going to happen next. So, again, since medyo short na blue laws and short din ang brown laws, there's a high likelihood na yun nga, may schedule sila on the same day. Alright, so, moving on, blue laws, as I said, there's 2 laws that are covered. And so with these 2 laws, kahit na medyo maiksi, I think it's still worthwhile to split up the 2 laws into their own lessons. So what that means, of course, is magkakadalawang lessons tayo. Okay? The first lesson will focus on the first law. And that first law is essentially the primary law in the Philippines on fisheries and aquatic resources. Okay? It's the Philippine Fisheries Code of 1998 as amended. Okay? After that, we're going to move on to Lesson 2, and Lesson 2 will cover the next law, which discusses the Laguna Lake Development Authority. Okay, that's the law. Well, we're going to talk about the law that created that authority, that body. Okay, which is a quasi-government agency focused on promoting sustainable development in a particular body of water, which of course you know, based on the title. that we're talking about Laguna Lake. Okay? So I think that's all I'm going to say about the laws. I think the best thing to do at this point is to just dive right in. So having said that, why don't we go ahead and proceed, and let's start with lesson number 1. So here we go, lesson number 1. And what we're going to be talking about is the Philippine Fisheries Code of 1998, which is also referred to as RA, or Republic Act number 8550 as amended. Before we dive right into the nitty-gritty, to the meat of this law, since I mentioned that it is amended, the amendment did not repeal it. The law itself continues to be enforced. What the amendment did was essentially focus on particular provisions, and that's where the amendments were applied. Okay, but I think it's worthwhile discussing just briefly how this amendment came to be. This is the amendment. It's Republic Act 10654, and it's got its own different title called, well, the title is An Act to Prevent, Deter, and Eliminate Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing. So medyo nakatutok siya sa provisions, or at least to the acts that are criminalized, right? And in a way, this was an essential teeth that needed to be put on the law. Kasi when this law was first put into effect in 1998, itong RA 8550, there were some provisions that were lacking. When I say lacking, they're not completely compliant with the some of the international standards. In particular, yung European Union had some standards that they, were suggesting that most, if not all, countries should be complying to. So those standards really meant a lot, because non-compliance would mean losing actually a significant amount of aid from the European Union. I think in this case, parang $9.5 million ata yung nakataya. So ang Philippines was already given a kind of a warning, and sinasabi na comply or else you're gonna lose that grant. Parang ganyan na nangyari. So this was during the time of President Aquino, and so they were able to, during that time, they were able to get their act together, and they were able to draft this amendment, which brings this law up to par with standards, the European Union standards, so that in such a way na, it was able to keep the grant. The Philippines was able to keep the grant. Okay, they didn't get to a point na red flag na hindi na pwede. Okay, but anyway, that was the amendment, and that was kind of the motivation behind the need to amend, and that happened I think it was about 2015 is when they put that amendment into effect. Okay, and like I said, it didn't repeal the entire law. It didn't repeal the entire RA 8550. Rather, it only amended particular provisions. So the rest of the law, RA 8550, remain in force to this day. Okay, or at least the entire law. But again, the only thing that changed really are the provisions that were amended by RA 1065. So what we're gonna find in terms of what this law is all about, okay, is exactly what is expressed in the long title. Okay, to simplify things, ang pinaka-focus talaga ng batas na to is really the fisheries and aquatic resources. Okay, and what the law provides specifically, itong act na to, this law, okay, what it's providing for the development, management, and conservation of these things that I mentioned, this focus, this fisheries and aquatic resources. As I said earlier, this law is essentially the primary law on fisheries and aquatic resources here in the Philippines. An important point about this law is in terms of its reasoning as to why it was put in place is so that it can respond to and address itong trends of blind resource exploitation. I'm not sure if that is readily evident, pero pag sinasabi nating blind resource exploitation, what we're talking about really is yung parang sige-sige lang without any consideration for the consequences of our action as it relates to paggamit ng resources. In this case, yung fisheries and aquatic resources. Yung sige-sige lang tayo, fish lang tayo ng fish, getting more than what we need, doing things that we're not supposed to be doing, but without really, we're doing it without regard really to the possible consequences. We're doing it blindly. So that's what's really being discussed here when it's being, when you refer to it as blind resource exploitation. Okay. It also aims to address an important point and an important connection, really. Kasi itong issue of resource degradation, yung na-diminish yung amounts of fishes and whatnot, may direct connection yan sa poverty. Rightly so, kasi kung isipin mo talaga ang Pilipinas, it's a archipelago with over 7,000 islands, 7,100 islands. So, ang malaking resource that we depend on is the resource that is given to us by the ocean. Because of that, a good percentage of the people depend on the ocean for its livelihood. So, naturally, kung medyo depleted or degraded or wala na masyadong available resource, then it's going to have an impact on prosperity, and of course it could also mean poverty. Ang idea here in this law is to try and address, it aims to try and address yung dalawang issues na yun, the way they're connected, the nexus between the two, the connection. Okay, so that is one of the intents or one of the aims of this law. Finally, it also sets a national policy on sustainable use of fishery resources to meet the growing food needs of the population. So let's take a look exactly as to what the law says about its policy. Let's take a look at the declaration of policy in the law. Okay, so there are a number of things that it says. I'm just paraphrasing kasi medyo mahaba-haba to. Okay, so in essence, the first thing it says on the policy when the law made the declaration is its aim to achieve food security. Okay, and what it's referring to really is food security in order to provide the food needs of the population. Okay, so it has to also take into account in its aim to deliver on that. Okay, to provide the food needs of the population. What it has to take into consideration are a number of factors that are not necessarily controllable, but factors that we should all be aware of. One, yung trends, yung changes, demographic changes for fishes. Okay, pati yung mga emerging trends in the trade of fish. Kasi there are times na mas mabenta itong type ng isang to, and then before you know it, hindi na kasing benta ng iba. So parang uso-uso, panapanahon kumbaga. So that's what it's talking about when we're talking about emerging trends in the trade of fish as well as aquatic resources. Okay? At hindi lang sa domestic market, that also applies to international markets kasi syempre, being that the Philippines, or at least the oceans or the bodies of water surrounding it are very rich in fisheries, there's a high demand for it internationally. Kaya nga, this emerging trends in the trade plays a role. It could play into this food security that we're talking about. Okay, And syempre, there is also the traditional law on, the law of supply and demand. That's also a factor that needs to be taken into consideration. So when we're talking about this first policy, the policy to achieve food security in order to provide the needs of the population, the food needs of the population, it has to, take into consideration some of those factors that I mentioned. Okay, what else is there? In the policy, it also points out the aim to limit access to the fishery and aquatic resources. Okay, and its first plan to make that happen is to limit who has exclusive use and enjoyment, and it's of course this law is giving that to the Filipino citizens. Okay, so you might wonder then, but yung mga foreigners, diba, they go to Dampa, and why are they able to buy fish? Diba nga, sabi nito ng law na to as a policy, it's the fishes, those resources in the ocean are exclusively for Filipino citizens, for the use and enjoyment of Filipino citizens. Well, when in cases like that, you have to keep in mind that the fish has to be quote unquote fished out of the ocean, right? And what the fisherman does with it, okay, that's up to him. He could either consume it or he can sell it, okay? But nonetheless, in terms of who has first dibs, kung sino yung may exclusive use and enjoyment in fishing those quote unquote fishes out the fish, medyo redundant, pero is really the Filipinos. So that's what this is really talking about, okay? To limit access to the fishery and aquatic resources of the Philippines for the exclusive use and enjoyment of Filipino citizens, okay? All right, what else? To ensure the national and sustainable development, management, conservation of the fishery and aquatic resources in the Philippine waters, okay? To ensure the rational and sustainable development, okay? We discussed sustainable a few times in the last module, and just to reiterate, when we say sustainable, sinasabi natin dito renewable, diba? So something that, if it's consumed, there has to be a way for it to regenerate, okay? So yung policy says that there has to be some means to ensure that, okay? There has to be some means to ensure that it's sustainable, the development, management, and conservation of the fisheries, okay? And of course, rational, when we say rational, it makes sense, diba? Hindi yung walang sense, but that the approach to ensuring the sustainable development is also that it's rational, that it makes sense, okay? What else? To protect the rights of fisher folks, okay? And just to be clear, may definition tayo, or the law has a definition. This specific law has a definition as to what a fisher folk is, okay? It says it's referring to people directly or personally and physically engaged in taking and or culturing and processing fishery and or aquatic resources. So medyo self-explanatory na yan. These are the yung mga manggagawa, kumbaga. I don't know if you could use that term for fishermen, but yung mga, average person that, really survives off the ocean. I think that's precisely what is being defined here when we say fisher folk, okay? So again, one of the policies is to protect the rights of those people, the fisher folk. All right, moving on. To provide support to the fishery sector, medyo self-explanatory na yan. I don't think we really need to discuss that in greater detail. Okay, and let's move on. To manage fishery and aquatic resources. Okay. To manage fishery and aquatic resources. Okay. So, ito medyo complex to, so maybe we'll just discuss it later if it warrants it when we talk about what the law provides. So, all right, let's just move on. Okay. To grant the private sector the privilege to utilize fishery resources. So, this also is self-explanatory. So it's really referring to yung mga negosyante, the private sector. So it's not just limited to yung mga regular fisher folk, but the law also has a policy aims to grant to those mga negosyante, the private sector, the same privileges that are given to fisher folk in being able to use the fishery resources. Okay. All right. So moving on, in terms of the scope of this law, it is really covering three different aspects. The first one, as it relates to territory, it is the law covers essentially everything and essentially all Philippine waters. So when we're talking about the territorial scope, yung territorial reach ng batas na to, it's all Philippine waters. Okay, and just to clarify as to what's included in that, kasama dyan yung, syempre, yung mga tubig where the Philippines has sovereignty and jurisdiction. Okay, and not only that, there's also the waters within the exclusive economic zone, the 200 nautical miles. So kahit na medyo malayo-layo na siya from the foreshore of the Philippines, as long as it's within the 200 nautical miles, then it's considered to be Philippine waters. Okay, not included on this summary, pero ang naisali dyan actually as being part of the Philippine waters. Actually, they didn't include it as a Philippine water, but it's also kind of covered. I think it may have been on the earlier policy. Pero anyway, it talks about yung high seas, and when it made mention of the high seas, it's really talking about the obligation of the Philippines in protecting, the obligation of actually sharing that obligation with our neighbors, in the Philippines, of protecting, conserving, developing, and managing those fisheries and aquatic resources in those areas. So kahit na medyo outside of the Philippine waters as defined here in this scope, may obligation pa rin ng Pilipinas in ensuring that those resources, those fisheries and aquatic resources in high seas, even if they're outside of the Philippine waters, but parang in those areas na medyo nagbo-border with with its neighbors, the Philippines has some responsibilities in protecting and so forth, all those resources in those areas. Okay, so let's move on. Outside of the territorial scope, the Philippines also has at least this law also covers not just the territorial aspects, but here it's all aquatic and fishery resources, whether they're inland, coastal, or offshore fishing areas, and it includes, although not limited to, fish ponds, fish pens, and cages. So hindi lang yung mga aquatic and fishery resources on coastal areas, yung offshore, the ones that we just talked about, but also yung inland, the ones in fish ponds, fish pens, cages, etc. So, and in fact, not a fish pond, but a big body of water, yung Laguna Bay. That's probably a good example, and we'll talk about that when we get to lesson 2. Okay, so but nonetheless, the law covers that aspect. Okay. All lands devoted to aquaculture or businesses and activities relating to fishery, whether private or public lands. What the heck is aquaculture? Well, we have a definition. The law has that definition for it. It is fishery operations involving all forms of raising and culturing fish and other fishery species in fresh, brackish, and marine water areas. Okay? So parang ano lang to, yung what do you call it? Fish farming, That's what I guess aquaculture is a much nicer, perhaps a more scientific term for it. But in essence, it really is just the same as fish farming. I think that's what's commonly used. Yung mga bangus farms. So that's what it all really is. Okay. So now that we know exactly what this law is about, let's dive right in and look to see exactly how it provides for the development, management, and conservation of the fisheries and aquatic resources. So essentially what we're going to look to do is try to understand how this law provides, okay? So the very basic answer really is that it provides by regulating or putting some controls on the utilization, management, development, and conservation of these resources. So what kind of controls are we talking about? Well, controls as it relates to, for example, the use of Philippine waters. An example of the kind of control that you might find there, this is something that we've already discussed earlier, is the who specifically may be able to use Philippine waters. We said earlier that the law made it so only Filipino citizens have exclusive use and enjoyment of Philippine waters. So that's kind of I guess you can say, that's a good example of the control that we're talking about here. Now, there is an exception to the Filipinos only. The law does provide that in cases of research, non-Filipinos may partake, but there's some tight controls on that as well. Okay, so what other areas might we find controls? Okay, let's see. Okay, access to fishery resources. A control that we might find here is in the number of licenses and permits that may be issued for the conduct of fishing or fishery activities. So that's the kind of control that we might find when we're referring to access into fishery resources. And another interesting control, which looks fairly self-explanatory just based on the term itself, catch sealing. What that is referring to is the maximum number of fishes. It sets the limits or the quota on the total quantity of fish that one person can capture. What else? Well, there's also just to give time for regeneration so that fish can spawn. There are also controls on when one could fish. The law provides some limits on when fishing is allowed and when is considered close season for fishing. What else is there? Well, there's also instances where foreign aquatic species may need to be introduced, and of course in cases like that the law ensures that it has no detrimental effect on the environment and other species. Thus there is a need to have controls. Okay, and in addition to that, there's the need, of course, to protect yung mga rare, threatened, and endangered species. Okay. So additional things, okay, EIS, or the Environmental Impact Statement. This is not the first time you're hearing this. This is something that exists actually in pretty much any undertaking involving possible effect to the environment. You might recall when we were talking about mining, well, I don't know if I mentioned it there, but I know I mentioned it at a later, and I think in module 1 I mentioned the EIS. So anyway, in mining, of course, it's necessary to obtain an EIS, and I'm referring to an organization, an entity, or a company that might be looking to undertake a project which may have the potential for affecting, at least in mining, it may have the the possible effect of affecting protected areas, that sort of thing. Here naman, since we're talking about the resources, the fishery resource and aquatic resources, We're talking about projects that may have an impact on the fisheries and aquatic resources. So there is a definite need for any organization that is looking to undertake any activities or projects. There's a need for them to first conduct an environmental impact statement or study, and the output is the statement, and that's something that is submitted for review and for approval. And as I said before, you might recall, medyo maduguto. It's kind of a very intensive process, considering the consequence. If there is an effect, the consequence could be detrimental to the environment. So it's very important that this is done meticulously. Okay. So in addition to the EIS, actually as part of the EIS, when an organization who is to undertake an activity or a project, if his environmental impact statement is approved, the proof of that that would allow him to proceed with this project is the environmental compliance certificate. So that's a must-have for anybody that is looking to undertake any project, okay, involving the possible effect of the environment. Okay, what else? The law also provides some controls and measures in the monitoring, surveillance, and control of fishing. Okay, this is actually a system that would have to have been initially established by the DNR, and it is in coordination with the local government units, the farms. Well, let's explain what that FARMCs are. Okay, they're the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Management Councils. I will not discuss them here, but because there's a separate section where we'll talk a little bit about what that is, what constitutes the council, and what is its powers. Okay, so anyway, the coordination the DNR has to have when it comes to monitoring, surveillance, and controlling fishing not only involves not only LGUs, the local government units, but also the Fisheries and Aquatic Resource Management Councils, and just the same, the private sector, as well as other concerned agencies. So besides the regulations, or in this case the controls in the utilization, management, development, and conservation of fisheries and aquatic resources, this law also provides by giving the local government, namely the municipality or the city government, some jurisdiction, some control over the management, development, and conservation of fisheries and aquatic resources. So let's go over some of these jurisdictions just to give us an idea of the extent by which this law provides such jurisdiction. Okay, so let's start with the first. Essentially, the law gives the municipality and the city government overall basically control over municipal waters. When I say control, I'm again referring to the development, management, and conservation. So this control or this authority over these municipal waters is in coordination. So it's not just the LGU, but it's the LGU in coordination with the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Management Councils. Okay. Another jurisdiction granted the municipality and the city government is the ability to grant fishing privileges. Okay, so the privileges are generally only granted to fisherfolk, organizations, cooperatives, and the like. Since they're not really the only one, but they generally have the they have first dibs. They shall have the preference and the grant of these fishery rights. Okay, so that's what this is talking about. And again, the grant is something that the LGU has the authority to give to these fisherfolk and corresponding, or the fisherfolk organizations and cooperatives. Okay, what else? There is a central registry of fisherfolks. Okay, that the LGU is mandated by law to maintain. Okay, so the idea here is to maintain a list of those who are either fishing or may have a desire to fish in these municipal waters, and by having them registered, the idea or the purpose really is that of determining priorities among them. Okay, and of course this is limited only to municipal waters, that which the municipality or the city has jurisdiction over. Okay. There is also for support for municipal fisher folk. Okay, DNR in coordination with the local government. Okay, provide support for these municipal fisher folk, and the kind of support that they provide is generally like technology, research. They also give some credits, production and marketing assistance, and other like-kind services. But it's not limited to training for additional or supplementary livelihood. In other words, it's more than just training for livelihood or supplementary livelihood, but the other things that I also mentioned. Okay. The law also essentially spells out the rights and privileges of fish workers. So that's the fisher folks in a sense, but this generalizes, it talks about fish workers. Okay. They're entitled to particular privileges that are generally provided under the labor code, okay, the social security system, and other benefits under other laws or social legislation for any kind of worker. Now, this law also allows for a number of things. Thus, it has provisions for regulating these things. So, what exactly are these additional things that it allows? Let's take a look. So, there's a number of them, but let me focus in on. I think I focused on three of them here. The first one is commercial fishing. Okay, and what we're talking about here, as to what this law regulates relative to commercial fishing, is the need to be licensed in order to operate any of the vessels, whether it's a commercial fishing vessel, a pearl fishing vessel, or even a vessel just for scientific research or educational purposes. The law requires that to operate those vessels, there must be a license. One must be licensed. Okay. In addition to license for the operation of these vessels, there is also need to obtain a license to engage in any of the fishery activities. Okay, so not just to operate the vessels, but to actually engage in the operations or in the actual fishery activity. Okay. Moreover, the need to even seek employment as a fish worker, that also needs a license. Okay, so basically what we're talking about here are fish workers that would be working for an outfit that does commercial fishing. So their work could potentially involve fishing, actually doing the net fishing. And by the way, here in the Philippines, I think what is mostly used or allowed by DFAR, insofar as net fishing is concerned, is the one referred to as paaling. Okay, apparently that's the one that is safer to use. It does not cause any kind of destruction to the corals. Okay, so anyway, that's the fish worker that we're referring to, those that are involved in commercial fishing and are thus the same that also need to obtain a license from DFAR before they can seek employment. Okay, with these outfits. There is also a need to register the vessels and the gear. So even the paaling nets are subject to registration, much the same as the vessels I mentioned earlier. The actual commercial fishing vessel, the pearl fishing vessel, or even the one that is used for scientific research or educational purposes. Those all need to be registered. Okay. Lease of fish ponds and registration of fish hatcheries and private fish ponds. Let's start with the lease of fish ponds. What is being referred to here really is public lands that is no longer being used for any purpose, but is suited or suitable for aquaculture. Being that's the case, the government can then make it available as a fish pond that could be leased out under a fish pond lease agreement. Okay, fish hatcheries naman, what we're talking about there are facilities where fish could be hatched, okay, or bred. Okay, and of course, private fish ponds are self-explanatory. Now, what we're talking about when we're talking about these hatcheries as well as the private fish ponds, these two need to be registered with the local government unit, since the local government unit in the municipal waters or in the municipality would be the ones who have jurisdiction over these facilities. Okay, another item that is included in the provision: importation and exportation of fishery products. Of noteworthy mention is the allowance for exportation. Generally, exportation of live fish is prohibited. Okay, it is only allowed in cases where the fish that are to be exported are those that are hatched at accredited hatcheries and ponds. Okay. In addition, there is also a consideration as to how such exportation might affect food security. You might recall earlier in this presentation we were talking about food security, so you might recall the different considerations there. Considerations on trade, the law of supply and demand, all of those things, anything that can affect essentially the food security. Okay, so again, for exportation purposes, before such fishery products may be allowed, there is also a need to determine how it might affect the food security. Okay, moving on. All right. So, okay. In addition to those regulations, the three that I mentioned, what is also provided in this law as a means to effectively provide for the development, management, and conservation of the fisheries and aquatic resources. The law actually reconstituted the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, the BFAR. Okay, and in reconstituting, this is what it did. Okay, first, it created a position, an Undersecretary for Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. This position is under the Department of Agriculture, which in fact BFAR is under. And the person that would hold this position is a presidential appointee. Okay, and his responsibility is solely to attend to the needs of the fishing industry. Okay, so that's the function of this USEC. Secondly, I mentioned already that BFAR is under the Department of Agriculture and is essentially the primary government agency on fisheries and aquatic resources. BFAR is a line bureau under the Department of Agriculture, and it has a great deal of responsibility. Like I said, they are the primary government agency when it comes to the development, management, and conservation of the fisheries and aquatic resources. They're the primary agency for that. But they have a whole lot of other responsibilities, quite a number to enumerate actually. But let me see if I can quickly mention a couple of them. One of the things that they do is they prepare and implement a national plan, a national fisheries industry development plan. They're also the same, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, they're the same that one would go to get a license to operate a vessel, a commercial fishing vessel, or even the license to to seek employment as a fish worker. They're the same agency or bureau that one needs to go to. Okay. They are also responsible for doing the monitoring and reviewing fishing agreements, okay, between Filipino citizens and foreigners. Because there are times when there's a collaboration involving Filipino citizens who, as you recall, have the exclusive right to the use and enjoyment of fisheries and aquatic resources in Philippine waters. But you might also recall that there are waters outside of the Philippine waters that the Philippines has a responsibility and an obligation for. And just the same, the neighbors would have similar, if not the same, as obligations and responsibilities. So there are cases when, since it's high seas, nobody really owns it. You can pretty much go there and fish. There are instances where the neighboring countries, or at least some of the outfits on both countries, would jointly come to an agreement on how they might conduct their fishing activities in those international waters. So in cases like that, BFAR would be the agency that would take a look and review those agreements. An important point of mention, which looks like I may have inadvertently omitted from my presentation, is with regard to the functions of BFAR. Okay, this is actually somewhat relevant to the focus or the objective of this course, since it kind of provides a basis for identifying BFAR as a prospective employer if and when you decide to make the move to become a environmental law enforcer. Okay. Essentially what I'm trying to say here is that among the responsibilities and functions of BFAR is, of course, the responsibility of enforcing all laws, and the formulating and enforcing of all rules and regulations, specifically those that govern the conservation and management of fishery resources. Okay, so that implies a number of things, including investigative work. Naturally, that's part of enforcing laws. Okay, now BFAR is part of the national government, so naturally their jurisdiction is national in character, which of course means that in relation to laws, local ordinances, that sort of thing, anything that pertains to the municipal waters, those are the only exception to the jurisdiction of BFAR in relation to this function of enforcing laws. Okay, the function of enforcing laws in municipal waters fall with the local government unit. Okay, so having said that, let's move forward and let's talk about the councils. The law does provide some provisions that allow for the creation of a number of councils. It's kind of a hierarchical type of organization. Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's start with just the general council, the Fisheries and Aquatic Resource Management Councils, or FARM-C. Okay, here's some general information about these councils. They're actually the byproduct of, in other words, they're formed by organizations and cooperatives of fisherfolk. Okay? And it also involves NGOs in that same locality. In order for them to form these councils, they're assisted by the local government unit, as well as other government entities. It's not entitled, this is entity, so I misspelled there, this entry. Anyway, they are established in, as I said earlier, medyo may hierarchy. They're not necessarily reporting to one another, but there's different councils for different levels of government. Okay, so this one, this general fact about the council speaks to the fact that there is one established at the national level, as well in all municipalities / cities abutting municipal waters. Of course, when we say abutting, in case that's not a common word. That's what it really is just saying is bordering. Abutting is another word for bordering. There's municipal waters. Okay, so let's move forward. The third thing here that is of noteworthy mention is that the formation or the process of organizing a council, there is a need for consultation and orientation, okay, that the LGUs, NGOs, and fisherfolk and other concerned officials, public officials, must undergo. So that's an important point of mention, and this is before a council is formed, okay, or organized. So now let's talk about the mother of all aquatic resources management councils. This is the National Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Management Council. I refer to it as the mother of all councils because this is the bigger one. It's the one that has jurisdiction over the entire nation, naturally because it's national. But it's also noteworthy to mention that it comprises some of the big wigs in the government, as well as non-government entities. Okay, for example, this council, this National Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Management Council, is chaired by the Undersecretary of the Department of Agriculture. The Undersecretary of the DILG is a member, along with naturally the fisher folks and fish workers. There are also members of the academe that play in, and also since they do participate in many fisheries related matters, representatives from fisheries related NGOs. Okay. So what do they do? Well, they have a number of things that they're responsible for, in terms of what their function is. But a common one across the board is that they assist in the formulation of policies for the protection, sustainable development, and management of fishery and aquatic resources. The only difference really is the extent of that policy. Naturally, since we're talking about the National Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Management Council, ang magiging scope ng plan nila or their policy, the development plan and policy is national. So it's the national policy for the protection, sustainable development, and management of fishery and aquatic resources. Also of noteworthy mention, which is also consistent across the board insofar as the purpose or the function of these councils. They serve as advisory / recommendatory bodies, and in a few minutes we'll provide some examples as to how fulfill that obligation or that role. Okay, let's move forward. Excuse me. Okay, so this one now is the council for the municipal / city. Okay, that's why the acronym is M/C Farm C. Okay, it's the municipal / city fisheries and aquatic resources management council. Okay, again, they are involved in the development, mainly in assisting the preparation of the fishery development plan. But unlike the national, which is focused on the national plan, this one is focused on its jurisdiction, which is the municipality or city. So what they're assisting with, insofar as preparation is concerned, is the municipal fishery development plan. Okay, as I said earlier, this body, these councils, provide as advisory recommendatory bodies. So here's an example of exactly how they provide that function. So here in the municipal level, they're also able to make recommendations for the enactment of fishery ordinances in the municipality. That's one of the functions that they're able to do, unique to their jurisdiction. Excuse me. Now, kanina, when I was talking about one of the functions of BFAR, I mentioned that the BFAR also enforces all laws, all related laws, to fisheries related laws. Okay, and the only exception are the municipal waters. So this is referring to the same thing. Okay. In other words, the people or the entities or the bodies that have jurisdiction over enforcing laws within the municipal waters are the local government units, the pertinent personnel within that, within that local government. Okay, and the council here provides assistance towards the cause of that body or that entity or those persons. Okay, they assist in the enforcement of fishery laws, rules, and regulations in municipal waters. Okay, here's another advisory recommendatory example, an example of their function in that area. They do provide advisory to the Sangguniang Bayan or Panlungsod on fishery related matters. Okay. An important note, since we talked about the national and now the municipal and city, there is also one that could be created at the barangay level, and it's something that can be created as necessary. Okay, and it could be created by the local government unit. Okay, it says here, it's something that I took from the law. It says that the LGU may create the barangay fisheries and aquatic resources management councils and the lake-wide fisheries and aquatic resource management councils whenever necessary. Okay, so as you can see there, as I said, there's multiple levels. They're not necessarily reporting to one another, but they differ only in their jurisdiction and slightly as to their function, but in general they have the same advisory recommendatory function. Okay. Okay, so another council that can be created is the Integrated Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Management Council. This one doesn't refer to a particular locality, not to a city, not to a municipality, rather in terms of the types of bodies of waters. Okay, so in bays, gulfs, lakes, and rivers and dams bounded by two or more municipalities / cities. So circumstances may call for the creation of a council specific to that type of body. So the law provides that one can be created for that purpose, specifically for those bodies of water. Okay? So the last thing that the law provides, okay, because we're talking about what exactly are the things that this law provides insofar as development, management, and conservation of the fisheries and aquatic resources are concerned. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about what we find in the law, what the law provides. Reminder, of course, that's not an exclusive enumeration. We just pick and choose some relevant ones to give you an understanding of what this law provides. But there's a whole lot more that is provided. But anyway, the last thing that I want to bring up in that list is one that provides for prohibitions and penalties. And naturally, this takes us to the final part in our lesson that will focus on the prohibitions and penalties as provided by this law. So what are we going to find in this last part of this presentation, or of this lesson rather? This is where we're going to find essentially the list of what the law criminalizes, the provisions that are listed to be prohibited and thus penalized. And so this section answers the question of what acts are punishable. Okay. So in looking at this law, recall that this law was amended, but when it was first put into effect in 1998, there were 22 provisions, criminal provisions, 22 provisions that are considered criminal and are thus prohibited and penalized. Okay, and in that law, the original law, RA 8550, before it was amended, you would find those 22 criminal provisions in Section 86 to Section 107. Now, when it was amended sometime in 2015, basically what happened was many of the provisions were criminal provisions were literally changed. They were amended. They were made to be clearer. And since the purpose of the amendment was precisely to provide for the prevention, deterrence, and elimination of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, then the bulk of what we now will see under the amendatory law are precisely the specific provisions that were amended. Okay, and the other point I wanted to make is that besides amending the 22, the amendatory law also added a few more. So in the amendment, there are a total of 53 criminal provisions, starting at Section 86 up to Section 128. Okay, so we're not gonna spend the time to go over all 53. That would probably not be a productive use of our time, especially considering how in the last several laws that we've covered, we've pretty much determined how we're going to use these provisions. And I'm sure by now you've already mastered it. So there's no real necessity to go over each and every one of the provisions. But I do want to bring up one or a couple maybe that may be a little different from what we may have done in the past. Something to kind of introduce, something new to introduce as to what you might want to look for when you're looking for the elements of the offense. Okay, so let's take a look. I'm referring in this case, well, there's one in particular that I want to refer to, and that's the first provision. It's Section 86. This section has 3 paragraphs, And the title itself already tells you pretty much that what the element is, the main element is. Okay, the title is unauthorized fishing. So naturally, fishing by itself is the act, and we all know that that is not illegal per se. There's nothing morally wrong to warrant it being an illegal act. Okay, but there has to be something that would make it illegal, and that something is the unauthorized, doing the fishing, yet you are not authorized to do so. Okay, and that's still fairly broad. So naturally, we'll have to look at the provision of law. Anyway, looking at that first paragraph, medyo madali lang to. I mean, this first paragraph is consistent with the other provisions that we've looked at. In other words, when I say madali lang to, we should be able to quickly answer the three questions just by reading it one time. Okay. First question, of course, is who is the offender who committed the act? Okay. And the second question is, what is the act? And if that act by itself is not necessarily illegal, what exactly makes it illegal? Okay, so those are the three questions. So reading this first paragraph, we could already ascertain and quickly identify those three elements. Okay, so I'm not going to read it anymore. I'm sure you've read it while I was talking. And here we could identify the first element, which is the offender, and that's any person. We could also quickly see, just because of the sequence in which the sentence is organized, based on the sequence, we could already see the second element, which is the act, and the act is to capture or gather, blah 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 blah. Okay, and then lastly, that act, we could, just by looking at it, almost conclude by itself is not illegal. It's not. There's nothing immoral or anything wrong with it that would constitute it as an illegal act. There has to be something that would make it illegal, and that is the qualifier. That's the third question. And again, based on the sequence by which this sentence is organized, we can see that that's the next phrase, and that next phrase tells us what the qualifier is, which is without license or permit from the department or LGU. Okay. All right. So based on that, we can put that on our worksheet, and there you have it. The offender is any person. The act or omission is capture or gather, or to cause the capture or gathering of fish, fry, or fingerlings of any fishery species or fishery products. That's the act or omission. And what qualifies it as a crime is that it is done, that act is done, without license or permit from the department or the local government unit. Okay? So now this provision, section 86, there's three paragraphs here. So we were, from the first paragraph, we could again, we were quickly able to, find the elements of the offense. Now let's see what the other paragraphs say. Okay? The second paragraph, you'll see, also seems to imply that there is some act that is criminal, that is unlawful. Okay? So it's just one sentence. Let's read it. It says, except in cases specified under this code, it shall also be unlawful for any commercial fishing vessel to fish in municipal waters. Okay? So based on the way this sentence reads, okay, it is telling me, anyway, and maybe telling you also, that as a general rule, it shall be unlawful for any commercial fishing vessel to fish in municipal waters. That's the general rule. That's what it's telling me, okay? Because the exception is the first part of the sentence. It says except. See, I mean, the fact that it even starts with the word except already tells you that it's an exception, which means that everything else that's said after is the general rule. So again, the exception here is in cases specified under this code. So in other words, it's unlawful talaga siya in general. Okay, and what is unlawful is the use of commercial fishing vessel to fish in municipal waters. Again, the use of any commercial fishing vessel to fish in municipal waters. That's the act that is generally unlawful. And the exception would be if there's something in this law that says otherwise. Okay, and so we have to refer back to the provisions of law. And there is clearly at least one that provides that exception, okay? And it's Section 18. Section 18 talks about the users of municipal waters, okay? It essentially lays out who may be able to use the municipal waters, okay? And if you read that, it says that the city government, the municipal or city government, okay, may, through its local chief executives, that would be the mayor, and acting pursuant to an appropriate ordinance, so there must have been a law passed, okay, by the local sanggunian, okay, and that law should authorize or permit small and medium commercial fishing vessels. Remember, small and medium commercial fishing vessels to operate within 10.1 to 15 kilometer area from the shoreline in municipal waters as defined herein, provided that all of the following are met. So there's an additional criteria there, okay? So yeah, I mean that essentially says that in general, going back to the second paragraph, in general, unlawful talaga for a commercial fishing vessel to fish in municipal waters. Except, this is the exception as provided by this section, okay? If it's a small and medium commercial fishing vessel and it operates within a particular distance from the shoreline and it meets all these other criteria, and provided that that permit, that license to fish in municipal waters is provided by local law. So all of those conditions have to be met. All right. So anyway, you could already tell from here what the act is. The act is the commercial fishing vessel fishing in municipal waters. Okay, and you could already tell what the qualifier is. Okay, well, I mean technically there is no qualifier because it's a general rule. Okay, but you can just specify that unless there's a law, and according to Section 18, okay, so you can maybe put on your worksheet, okay, that the qualifier is that it's not in compliant with Section 18, all the provisions of Section 18, okay, and the act is, act of fishing using a commercial fishing vessel in municipal waters. Okay, now notice this thing doesn't have any indication as to who might be the offender. So medyo tricky to, di ba? So conventional thinking, we're talking about a commercial fishing vessel. So siguro unang naisip niyo would be the owner. Yeah, that's possible. He could certainly be liable, or maybe the operator, or both. Okay, or maybe even the complement. Okay, but one thing to make it possibly even easier is if we go to the third paragraph. Okay, kasi the third paragraph says that any person who is discovered to be in possession of fishing gear or operating a fishing vessel, okay, in a fishing area where he has no license or permit, okay, is prima facie presumption that the person is engaged in unauthorized fishing, okay, prima facie presumption. So parang you're concluding, although it's rebuttable, syempre, but there's just based on those facts and circumstance, the conclusion is that this guy is committing an unauthorized fishing. So there is that presumption, be it rebuttable, but then the burden shifts to him to prove otherwise. Okay. Anyway, that sentence, that paragraph, in relation to the second paragraph, kind of provides this. Okay. So yung second paragraph talks about general rule, it's unlawful, but the exception is if there is a permit or a license provided by the local chief executive as provided by law, for as long as that licensee, that permittee, complies with all of the terms of that license or permit, right? Okay, So that said, the other thing you will want to consider also is when you're given a license, okay, the physical manifestation, that piece of paper, that ID, is not the license, okay? All that is just a manifestation that you are given authority, right? The license is your compliance, okay? Your compliance to those terms, compliance to the law, okay? Well, whatever, like in this case, it says there has to be a law, right? We're talking about the exception on paragraph 2. It says there has to be a law, and it's up to the chief executive whether to issue it or not. And it has to be a small or medium-sized vessel, and the vessel could only operate at a certain distance from the foreshore, and all these other criteria. Okay, so the person that has that physical license, okay, that manifestation that he's licensed, could actually do fishing in those areas, provided that he is doing it within the confines of his license, because that's what he was licensed for. Therefore, if he is not in compliant, if he, for example, violates the distance rule, or instead of a small or medium vessel, he's using a large vessel, anything that goes outside the bounds of that license, okay, is tantamount to no license, right? Because he has no license to operate a large vessel, because the license he has only allows him to operate a small or medium vessel. So therefore, he has no license, right? So that said, you now go to the third paragraph. Okay, the third paragraph says there's prima facie presumption. When somebody's operating a vessel or in possession of fishing gear, and he has no license or permit, right? So again, if you have a physical license, but what you're doing is outside the bounds of the license, you have no license. Therefore, okay, you are presumed to be committing unauthorized fishing. So there you have it. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because that's how I would translate it as an investigator. Okay, you're presented with certain facts and circumstance similar to this provision, perhaps, and you're now having to refer to this provision to see if there is indeed a violation, if there is indeed unauthorized fishing. And the first paragraph here was easy. Okay, we already know how to do that. Okay, the second paragraph was a little tricky, but I think since it's only one sentence and we can quickly ascertain that the general rule is it's unlawful, and as an exception you have to look at other provisions of this law to see where it might be allowed. Okay, and if it is allowed, what are the instances where it is allowed? Okay, so anyway, yun. So this what I just went through basically is kind of a way to just analyze the provisions of law when you're confronted with this kind of situation. Hopefully this makes sense. It's unfortunate we are not given the opportunity to personally interact. So I think this is a very interesting discussion, like real face-to-face discussion. You may have some additional thoughts about this, additional perspective, but this is how I would translate this provision, and what I want to impart basically is that, you have to sort of think outside of the box, or rather just, be careful at analyzing and seeing how it might help you in your investigations, because sometimes what you see on the surface is, not necessarily it. It's you have to kind of analyze it to see if there's something there that really means something different. Okay, so anyway, as I said, we're not going to go through the remaining 52 provisions. I'm gonna let you do that on your own, like I did the last one. You already have an idea of how to create a simple worksheet to help you identify the elements, those 3 questions. Again, I would encourage you, like I have always been in the last lessons, to try and analyze those provisions yourself. Okay, it's up to you, but I don't think it's completely essential at this point to really look at every single provision of the entire law, as long as you have a general idea as to what the law is about. Okay, what I think is important at this point, considering your where you're wanting to go, where you want, you want to be a environmental law enforcer with some investigative work, then I think it's probably more practical at this stage to kabisaduhin, so to speak, how the criminal provisions are put together and how you might be able to quickly ascertain what the elements are. Okay, so that said, I would encourage you do it on your own. And look at these provisions and go from there. Okay, so that said, I think we are done at this point with lesson 1. We are now ready to go to lesson number 2 under blue laws. Hey there, welcome back. We are still studying the module on blue laws, the second module in the series. And we have actually just completed lesson 1. So let's set that aside and let's now focus on the second and last lesson under blue laws. This time around, the law that we will look into is the law that created the Laguna Lake Development Authority. So it's the law referred to as the Laguna Lake Development Authority Act, or RA 4850 as amended. Okay. So besides creating the Laguna Lake Development Authority, or LLDA, it also prescribed or provided for the powers of the LLDA, including its functions and duties. So in terms of purpose, the law tells us that it is, the purpose of this is to promote and accelerate the development and balanced growth of the lake itself, and also all of the areas surrounding the lake, the provinces, cities, and towns. Okay, and this approach, or this objective of promoting and accelerating, involves, or is based on rather, on the national and regional plans and policies for social economic development. Okay, specifically for the area that we talked about, the Laguna Lake itself, as well as the surrounding areas, the provinces, towns, and cities. Okay, and in terms of how what it covers, this means of promoting and acceleration, it is to include measures that are for environmental management and control. Okay, preservation of undue ecological disturbances, deterioration, and pollution. Okay, so a lot of what we're saying here seems a little blurry for now. Medyo may pagka-flowery, legalistic words and phrases that are being used here. But I think the easiest thing to just keep in mind as to the purpose of this law, yun lang, is that it's purposed on promoting and accelerating the development and balanced growth of the Laguna Lake area and the surrounding provinces, cities, and towns. Okay, so that's the baseline understanding of what is the law all about. Okay, the next question, of course, is that ano ba tong lake na to? Well, what is this body of water? Why is it so significant that it would require a law to create an agency just so it can effectively promote and accelerate its efforts? Why not yung SAPA that runs alongside the border of, say, Marikina and Rizal? Why not those small bodies of water or other bodies of water? Okay, why this one? What is so significant about this? Okay, so in order for us to learn the answers, umpisahan natin by looking at exactly where this body of water is. So let's pull up the map of the Philippines. And what we know, of course, is that this body of water is in the Luzon area. and it's right about there. I've circled it on the map. You can see it. And if we zoom in on this map, okay, we will see that this body of water is adjacent to Manila Bay. So on this picture, you'll see where Manila Bay is. It's that opening, okay, right about, it's almost like at the center of this picture, okay. Now, to the left of Manila Bay, and if we're looking at it, it'll be on the right side, of course, there is this seemingly heart-shaped configuration. It's colored green on this picture, but that's essentially the Laguna Lake. You know, they characterize it as being heart-shaped. So, you know, just based on this, you'll also see where it's at and why it's considered to look like a heart shape. But me personally, I don't think it looks like a heart. I think it looks more like the head of Wile E. Coyote. I don't know if you'll agree or not, but anyway, I think one reason why I see it that way, well, there's two reasons, but primarily, see, Wile E. Coyote is one of my favorite cartoon characters since I was growing up in the US. He's a very determined, you know, a very determined rascal, if you will. That, you know, essentially all of his life, you know, he's decided that no matter what, he's gonna catch, you know, whatever it takes, he's gonna catch Roadrunner. Okay, I mean, I don't know where he gets his money, but he is able to order all kinds of explosives and gadgets and machineries from the Acme catalog. He's really very, very determined, but unfortunately, it seems like his efforts are futile. You know, that it's hopeless, that he will never ever catch, no matter what, he'll never ever catch the Roadrunner. So kind of like what I, well, this is probably why I can sort of relate. You know, he is to Roadrunner as I am to pagmamahal. Okay, anyway, ito, medyo lumalabas na yung hugot. Joke lang yan. And it's just a brief commercial just to kind of shift things a little bit. Konting kwento rin, since we're sort of off on a tangent, just a konting kwento. Among the things that we've done in the past, that I've done in the past, involve also teaching or lecturing for college students. And you know, this unfortunately, environmental loss is not one of the more, it's not an exciting or a sexy subject. If anything, you know, when I started to discuss or lecture trafficking in persons, even if it's a crime, even if it's a horrendous crime, I think just the very nature, you know, the fact that it's a sexual nature is, you know, very appealing to, you know, puberty-aged college students. So, medyo nakasanayan kong gumawa ng mga kalokohan when I am having to discuss a subject that is otherwise extremely boring to them. So, and that's the reason why medyo nagka-commercial ako dito. Anyway, I hope you were amused by it. Nonetheless, so let's get a little bit more serious now. But one last thing before we proceed. You'll notice in this map, just below Laguna Bay, and on this picture, it's right behind the tail or the butt of Wile E. Coyote. There's this dark silhouette. It looks very familiar. The silhouette almost looks like Bart Simpson, and pretty much as sensitive, probably, as at least that's a body of water. So it's kind of a sensitive area, probably as sensitive as Bart in that, as I'm sure you'll remember, Taal Lake, where the Taal volcano is, was victim to the wrath of Taal volcano. Even if it wasn't a massive explosion, you might recall early this year in January, we were confronted with you know, what he has to say. He spewed lava up in the air, or at least ashes up in the air. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out. So now that you have a general idea of where it's at, and that's also one of the reasons why I brought up the Taal Lake, so you you have a frame of reference as to where exactly the Laguna Lake is. So now that you do have a frame of reference, I think we can now proceed to discuss why this body of water is so important enough that, or at least significant enough that it would warrant all of this attention. So let's talk about the characteristics that make this lake a significant body of water, okay? But before we dive right in, I think it's worthwhile discussing what is the right way to refer to this lake. You may have seen some materials or some documents refer to it as Laguna de Bay, and of course, like in this law, it's referring to it as Laguna Lake. So which is the right way to refer to this lake? Let's give a little bit of a history first as to why there are those two names for this lake, or two references for this lake. Let's start with Laguna de Bay. Okay, Laguna de Bay is actually based on the town of Bay, which is in Laguna. Okay, it's in the southern part of the bay, or rather the lake. Again, the town's name is Bay. Okay, during the time when Bay was the provincial capital, that was when they named the lake after that provincial capital called Bay, that town called Bay. All right, and Laguna, of course, in Spanish means lake. So Laguna de Bay, lake of the town of Bay. Okay, so that's why it was referred to as Laguna de Bay. Over time, Laguna Lake became a common reference to it, and it wasn't an attempt. It was not an attempt to translate Laguna de Bay, because then, if that was the case, it should be Bay Lake, right? Instead, what is being referred to when it's being called Laguna Lake is the province of Laguna. Okay, so Laguna as the province, lake as the body of water, the type of water, body of water that is in the province of Laguna. Okay, so Laguna Lake. Anyhow, those two references to this lake, the two ways that this lake is being referred to, are both correct. There are some materials to this day, maps and whatever, that refer to this body of water as Laguna de Bay. More current reference to it that you may see, example, this law refers to it as Laguna Lake. So, for our purpose, since we're discussing this law that refers to it as Laguna Lake, that is also how we're going to proceed to refer to it. Okay? So let's move on. Let's talk about the characteristics that make this lake significant. Okay? Let's talk about its size, and we're talking about geographic size. Okay? To start, this lake is being referred to as a shallow freshwater basin. Okay? It's a basin because the definition of a basin is that of a depression or a dip in the earth, in the surface of the earth. Okay, it's at a low point in the earth or in the surface of the earth, such that many things will flow to it, like fluids or liquids. Okay, so it's a basin in that regard. All right. And it just so happens that what is flowing to it, what it is catching, is water. And what kind of water? Fresh water. Tabang tubig, right? Not the salt water, but fresh water. And it's coming from different sources, tributaries, rivers, and whatnot. So it seems kind of familiar, because when in our last lesson, when we talked about a type of catch for water, an aggregation, place where water is aggregated to, and that's watershed. And in a way, this basin is a lot like a watershed. Actually, it's a watershed, but it's a large watershed. It doesn't exactly have the same characteristics as watershed, but insofar as its purpose of, or its eventual use as a collector of water, it serves the same, or it has the same characteristics as a watershed. So in a way, it's a watershed. Although this basin, Laguna Bay, also has a number of watersheds that collect water from various rivers and tributaries that empty into the Laguna Lake. Okay, so that's why it's a freshwater basin, but it is referred to as a shallow freshwater basin because of this. Even if at its deepest, the depth is actually it's pretty deep. It's 20 meters deep. That's at its deepest point. Even if that's the case, the average depth, because obviously there's different depth in different parts, but if you were to average it all, it would only average to 2.5 meters. That's about 9 feet deep. So that's the average depth. And that's why it's being referred to as a shallow freshwater basin. Mababaw, it's not that deep. Okay? In terms of the surface area, medyo malawak to. It covers quite a broad area. Approximately 900 square kilometers of surface area. That's what it covers. So medyo malawak to. Okay? In terms of average volume of water, it can hold an average of 2,250,000 cubic meter. That is a lot of water. Okay, so given this summary of its size, it's pretty obvious, or at least it explains why it is recognized as the largest lake in the Philippines. And not only in the Philippines, but throughout Asia, it is among the largest. The third largest throughout Asia. So it's fairly significant as to its size. Okay? So as to its reach within the Philippines, in its locality, how far does it reach? That's the next question. Okay? So let's talk about the shoreline. If I was to go to one of the shorelines in this lake, and I was to walk along that shoreline, the entire lake itself, where I start at one point and I end up in the same point. Okay, if I did that, I would have walked 285 kilometers. Okay, so that's a pretty long distance. Okay, and this 285 kilometers of shoreline, you'll find these shorelines in about 217 barangays that they are referring to as shoreline barangays. These 217 barangays are in 29 municipalities, and these 29 municipalities are in 3 provinces that provide the borders to this lake. Okay, the 3 provinces are Laguna, Rizal, and NCR, which is not a province per se, but it's a region. Okay. Anyway, in Laguna there are 18 of these municipalities. Rizal, there's 9, and in the National Capital Region there's 2. All right, and as I said, it's bordered by provinces of Laguna, Rizal, and NCR. And just so you have an idea of where they're at, if you look at the map on the left side, the parts that are colored orange or sort of golden yellow, that's like the province of Laguna. It's in the southernmost tip of the lake, and also even covers parts of the southwestern part, as well as the southeastern part. Okay, the pink colored region, pink or fuchsia or whatever you want to call it, but that shade anyway, that's the province of Rizal, and that's in the north, mostly north, but it's referred to as the northeastern part of the lake. And on the northwestern part of the lake, that's where you would find in green the National Capital Region. Okay, so that's kind of how it is laid out in terms of which borders where, or where a particular province is in relation to the lake. Okay, so let's move forward. We've seen how big it is, how much volumes of water, how many provinces it touches, and how many municipalities and barangays it touches. So we know how huge this lake really is, which makes sense when they refer to it as the largest lake in the Philippines. Okay, and being that it is the largest lake in the Philippines, surely it would also provide now a number of resources, or it is a source for a number of resources. Let's take a look at this lake as a resource. What exactly will we find here as resources? Okay, first, and this is probably the most obvious, and in fact it's the most dominant resource in the lake, is fisheries. Okay, when we're talking about the fisheries, what we're gonna talk about here is the amount of fish products or fishery products that are taken out of this lake. Okay, and if we're just talking about the native fishes that are not bred or whatever, they're not part of the aquaculture, right? They're just native, they're out in the wild in the lake itself. We're talking about a production of nearly 151,000 metric tons of fish products. Metric tons, that's a lot, okay? So just to allow us to wrap our heads around what that means, a metric ton is, one metric ton is equivalent to 1,000 kilos. 1,000 kilos. So we can easily gauge what 1 kilo is like in terms of weight and possibly volume. But based on that, I'm sure you could sort of gauge what 1,000 kilos would be. Okay, now you multiply that 1,000 times, that's metric tons. That's 1 metric tons. Okay, so in terms of the kind of the amounts, the amounts of fish that's produced out of this lake, okay, we're talking about nearly 150,000 metric tons. So you see how voluminous that is. Okay, all right. What else under fisheries? I mentioned aquaculture earlier. So the fish that's produced out of aquaculture facilities, okay, which is not included in the first set of numbers I gave you. The aquaculture outputs or production is 63,490 metric tons. Again, metric tons. That's still significant. Not as significant as the fish production from just out in the wild in the lake, but still significant considering that 1 metric ton is equivalent to 1,000 kilos. Okay. What other numbers could we add to this? Not that we can't, we shouldn't add anymore because it's already pretty overwhelming. But there are other numbers that add to this, and that's basically fish products that kind of come out of municipal waters. Okay. Recall our discussion in the last lesson about municipal waters. So naturally, this lake also has municipal waters. So the numbers I gave you earlier on the 151,000 metric tons, as well as the 63,000 metric tons from aquaculture, those numbers don't yet include municipal water, at least fishery that's produced out of municipal waters. Okay. So if we were to add the municipal waters, we would be adding 87,467 metric tons. So in all, that's a lot. It's really overwhelming. And by the way, these statistics, were based on that produced in 2012. That was 8 years ago. So surely by now that number has changed, and I'm thinking the change would be that it would have increased, especially considering the purpose of this law, which is to ensure the sustainability, that there's a means to regenerate whatever is being taken out. But surely there's also some programs that would aim to increase to keep up with the growing population. So again, this is an 8-year-old number that I gave you, and surely by now, because things have changed, there's a good chance that these numbers are even greater. Okay, so what other resources might we find in the Laguna Lake? Okay, agriculture. Okay, naturally it's not the lake itself that would produce agriculture products, but what we're talking about here really is the use of the lake in agriculture, namely as a source of water to a certain number of areas that could be targets for irrigation. Okay, so irrigation, as we know, is the means of tapping into a body of water, and like maybe a pipe or something, and being able to suck that water and bring it to a given area where there's plantation that need to be watered regularly. Okay, so here, again, this is also a 2012 number. It was said at the time, according to the National Irrigation Administration. Sorry, this is actually a 2013 number, December 2013. According to the National Irrigation Administration, there were at the time in 2013 32,684 potential estimated irrigable areas. So those are basically any of those areas within the 3 provinces. Nonetheless, 32,000 is a significant number of areas that could be the target for irrigation sourced from Laguna Lake. Okay. Besides agriculture, what other resources might we find in Laguna Lake? Okay, well, of course, in agriculture, we already said irrigation, and in a way, that means it's a water supply. But the water supply that's being discussed here refers to the water that ends up in our homes. The same that is brought to our homes by Maynilad. Okay. So Maynilad not only gets its water sources from various reservoirs near the Metro Manila area. So it's not only the places that we may be thinking of, but also Laguna Lake is among its sources. Okay, and let's see, did I provide numbers? No, I didn't. Okay, so in terms of water supply, again, it provides us a water supply, and the water that we're talking about is the same one that comes out of our faucet. Okay, so Laguna Lake provides us a source for that. Okay, Manila is what brings us that water from Laguna Lake, among other reservoirs. Okay, so in addition to water supply, another resource that you can say comes from, perhaps not directly, but comes from the Laguna Lake is electricity. Okay, and the way this is done is through 3 power plants. There are 3 power plants that actually take water from Laguna Lake, and from that water that they're able to take, they're able to generate electricity, whether it's through some kind of free flowing, like a dam, where they dam it, and then the energy of the current, the flowing water, generates electricity. Whether it's through that means or some other means. The point is, there are 3 power plants that generate, 758 megawatts of total dependable capacity. Okay, and again, that's 3 power plants that are getting essentially that energy from Laguna Lake. One of those power plants provide the bulk. I said 758. It's Kalayaan. That power plant called Kalayaan produces about 720 megawatts. And then the other 2, they don't provide as much, but they do still add to the number. Okay. What other resources or uses might there be from the Laguna Lake? Well, let's take a look. Okay. Floodwater reservoir. Okay, this is an interesting one. So far, I think many of what we've mentioned, or at least some of what we previously mentioned, talk about taking from the lake and using that as a resource for something. Floodwater reservoir, at least this concept, is the reverse of that. What the lake is being used for here is as a reservoir, as a place where water is to be put into, okay? And the kind of water that we're talking about is flood water, okay? And so this floodwater reservoir concept is aimed to reduce flood water in parts of the area, most notably that from Metro Manila. You might recall, or I'm sure you're familiar, living here in, more than familiar, living here in Metro Manila, that it doesn't take very much rain for Metro Manila to get flooded. It only takes a short downpour, large downpour of rain, 10 minutes, 15, 20, or even just 20 minutes. And surely the entire Metro Manila that is rained on would already be flooded easily. But we do know that the water does not stay very long. It eventually subsides. Depending on how much water there is, it can take minutes, and in worst cases, maybe hours, okay? But it does subside, right? And the question, of course, is where does that water go, okay? And as a floodwater reservoir, that answers where that water goes. The Laguna Lake is a floodwater reservoir, and that water that comes from floods eventually make it to Laguna Lake, okay? And since it's serving as a reservoir. And the question then is, how does it get there? Yeah, here in this region and in Metro Manila, there's actually two companies that provide the means for that water to get to Laguna Lake. There's a company called Mangahan Floodway and another called Napindan Hydraulic Control System. And they have the machinery that essentially sucks up all the water, all the flood water, okay, and brings it over and drains it, or delivers it to Laguna Lake. And so that's precisely the purpose or the service that they provide. Okay, and so that kind of gives you an idea of how flood water is reduced in Metro Manila and where it goes. All right. So what other uses or resources can we find in Laguna Lake? All right. So besides floodwater reservoir, industrial cooling is another, and this is essentially for companies or organizations that manufacture, or essentially they have large-scale operations which require industrial grade cooling, and of course water is what they're using for that cooling system. And again, it's industrial grade, so we're talking about something that is large scale, that would take water from the lake and deliver it to that organization or that company, and the company would do something to convert it into a cooling system. Okay, so that's one of the uses for the waters in Laguna Lake. And let's see, what else might there be? Oh, actually, I think I have some numbers on this industrial cooling. Let's see, just to kind of give you an idea of how much water is taken from the lake for this purpose. I think I do have the number. Let's see. Yes, I do. Okay. So every year, it is estimated that 2.4 billion cubic meter of lake water is taken out of Laguna Lake to be used for this purpose, to be used as industrial cooling. So that's a lot of water, okay? But nonetheless, we are seeing, especially with the previous resource that we talked about, the floodwater reservoir, that there is a plan or a system in place that despite the amount of water that's being taken out of the lake, there is a system to put back water to replace what's been taken. So it's making it so that water is renewable. There's a sustainable system, so that the lake doesn't dry out, so to speak. I mean, it probably won't anyway, because as long as we're not in drought. But anyway, that is part of the system in place, part of the mechanisms that are provided by this law. a plan that ensures that. So that's this what we talked about. These two resources are great examples of what we might find in the law in terms of a plan to ensure that there is sustainabody. Okay, so let's move forward. Let's see, what else do we have here? What other uses or what other means is the Laguna Bay being used for as a resource? Let's see, I think I have a few more. Okay, business establishments. What we are referring to here is the number of establishments, of enterprises, whether they're large, medium, or small. The large number of them that rely on the Laguna Lake to help them produce their products, okay, whatever that product might be. As of 2012, there were an estimated 500,000, so about 500,000 of these enterprises, large, medium, and small, okay, that depend on the Laguna Lake. There may be more of them now. Again, this is an old statistic. It's the only one available, unfortunately. At the time that this data was analyzed. But anyway, it's very likely that the numbers are much greater now. Okay. So in any case, the use that they have is, that they would tap the Laguna Lake for, perhaps just the water, or maybe some of the other resources to aid them or to provide as raw materials for their products. Okay. So what else? Okay. As they say, it's cliche really. They say that the shortest distance from one point to another is a straight line. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about here when we talk about waterways. Okay, let's say you're coming from Metro Manila, from the NCR, in the green area, if you're looking at the map. Okay, and you have a need to get to the southeastern part of Laguna. Okay. What you would need to do if you had a car is to drive around along the western and southwestern part of the bay to get to your destination. So you'll be driving around almost like in a C configuration. Okay, and the distance would probably be greater compared to if you were just driving a straight line. Okay. So since the Laguna Lake is a body of water that people can use as a waterway, then essentially you are given the opportunity to take that straight line, that short distance, that straight line to give you that short distance. Granted, it may take a little longer, but it is nonetheless an option that's provided for by the lake. Okay, since it can serve as a waterway. Okay, and not only to transport persons but also cargo. So that's another use for the Laguna Lake. What else? Recreation. Okay, that's pretty obvious. Picnic grounds, and it's also for people that enjoy fishing. Just recreational fishing, not not as a business or anything like that. Boating and sailing, that sort of thing. So that's a use for it's not for business or anything probably like that, but it is nonetheless a use that is worthwhile mentioning, a use of the Laguna Lake. Okay, what else might there be? Okay, ecotourism. Yes, that is an important one, especially now that we have a lot of environmentally conscious persons. The Laguna Lake is an interesting body of water. There is some diversity there, environmental diversity that I'm sure would make it a worthwhile destination for tourists who are interested in ecotourism. So that's another one that we could add to the list. Okay. Anyhow, If you were to take everything that we've discussed, I mean, this is just a summary of what are the significant uses and what are the significant things that make Laguna Lake an important resource. Okay, and with this just summary, we really are given a basis to say, that this is really a significant resource. It's a significant, lake. It's something that justifies the need for protecting it, for ensuring that there is effective development, and so on and so forth. Therefore, warranting or at least providing the justification and basis for the creation of this law. Okay, so with that said, I think at this point we have an idea of what this law really is all about and what it aims to do, what its purpose is. So I think at this point we can now dive right in and see how it delivers on those objectives. Now let's answer the question of how it provides. How does this law provide? How does it promote and accelerate the development and balanced growth of the Laguna Lake area? Okay. Well, we know just based on the title of the law that it creates a body, an authority. So essentially, it is able to promote and accelerate by creating the Laguna Lake Development Authority. Okay, and the law naturally provides that in creating this authority, it provides for the powers, functions, and duties of this authority. And so of course, these things that I just mentioned refer to special powers that it has, special powers and function, and also corporate functions. Okay, and what do we mean by that? Okay, first of all, the LLDA is a quasi-government agency, and by being called or referred to as a quasi-government agency, it has not only regulatory functions, but also proprietary functions. And when we say proprietary functions, we are referring to things that usually a regular corporation, a partnership, what else? A natural person would be authorized to do under existing laws. Okay, so things like being able to enter into contracts of any kind, to acquire, buy, purchase, hold, or lease personal and real property as it deems necessary, to purchase, hold, alienate, mortgage, pledge, or otherwise dispose of shares of the capital stock, okay, or bonds, securities, or other evidence of indebtedness that is created by it as a corporation. Okay, so it can do those proprietary functions. Of course, as a quasi-government agency, it's got regulatory functions also, which, because it is a quasi-government agency, is reporting through some other government agency, and that government agency that is given that supervision is the DNR, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Take note, though, that the supervision is really just administrative, so it doesn't have actual, supervision in terms of policy, establishing policies and whatnot, or policy making supervision or anything like that. It's all just administrative, just to facilitate what the LLDA may need, source from the government. Okay, so there you have it in terms of reporting structure. But what other functions, regulatory functions, what might we find under the law? Well, one important one, which is really more of an obligation, is that the LLDA is to do or make comprehensive surveys. And these surveys, of course, are purposed on determining the physical and natural resources as well as the potentials for the Laguna Lake region. Okay, a quick point, just to digress. When we say Laguna Lake region, or occasionally maybe referred to as Laguna de Bay or Laguna de Bay region, we're really referring to the lake itself as well as the surrounding provinces. Essentially, if you remember the map that we were looking at just moments ago, it's all of those. The lake itself as well as the 3 provinces that are essentially touching the lake. You have the Laguna province, Rizal, and of course the National Capital Region. So again, that is the Laguna Lake region. So when you hear me refer to Laguna Lake region or Laguna de Bay region, that's precisely what I'm referring to. So now we go back and resume with enumerating some of the LLDA's powers and function. So yes, of course, as a quasi-government agency, excuse me, it is to regulate and monitor activities in the Laguna Lake region. Okay, so not limited to just regulating. Of course, there is that proactive, activity of monitoring exactly what is going on in the Laguna Lake region. And in order to be able to put some controls on those activities that it's regulating and monitoring, it naturally has to have the ability to, permit and license those activities. So being that that's the case, it has exclusive jurisdiction to issue permits, and for the use of all surface waters for any projects or activities. So what kind of projects or activities is this bullet point referring to? An example would be sewage works and industrial waste disposal systems. Okay, before anybody undertakes any of that, there is a need to, of course, obtain authority or be permitted by the LLDA. What else? Okay, the LLDA naturally, in order to preserve the Laguna Lake region so that it can be effective at promoting and accelerating its development and its balanced growth, okay, it has the powers and functions to ensure prevention and abatement of pollution. Okay, so it does, oversee licensing. I mean, there are certain cases where there may be a need to discharge some additional waters into the lake. So hindi pwedeng basta-basta lang magagawa yun. You can't just discharge water in Laguna Lake, especially mass amounts of water. There is obviously a need to go to the LLDA and be authorized. In fact, they have those permits that they specifically refer to as discharge permits. Okay, and again, that speaks precisely to ensuring that pollution is prevented and abated. Okay, what else? Okay, so I think this is the last point on this. In order that the LLDA to again be effective, the law gives it powers to create force multipliers. And what I mean by that is it can actually tap other agencies. Okay, it can tap them and seek from them assistance in enforcing, its authority over the Laguna Lake region. Okay, it can deputize basically those agencies, those appropriate government agencies or instrumentalities, again for the purpose of enforcing. Okay, so as you can see, the Laguna Lake Development Authority is imbued with broad powers. And again, this is important. And by the way, that when we say broad powers, it's not limited to those that regulatory powers or functions, but as we said earlier, proprietary functions. So again, that speaks to how broad its powers and functions are. And of course, that is so it can be effective in its purpose of promoting and accelerating the development and balanced growth of the Laguna Lake region. Okay, so now let's proceed to talk about the next part in our discussion of the Laguna Lake Development Authority Act. And this one is actually the last part. And we're going to proceed to talk about, being the last part, of course the focus would be on the acts that are punishable. We'll look to answer what is provided by this law as to what acts or omissions are punishable. Okay, so in looking at the law itself, we're gonna find a section, only one section actually, section 39A, that provides for this. So that's a little weird, no? Pero let's see why that is and what else might be needed to make sure that we are able to effectively determine what acts are punishable. Okay. All right. So let's quickly read it. Section 39A. It provides obviously for the penal, but not just penal, but even civil liability. Okay. So it says any person, natural or juridical, who shall violate any of the provisions of this act or any rule or regulation promulgated by the authority, and the authority in this case is the LLDA, pursuant thereto, shall be liable for this punishment. Excuse me. Okay, so looking at it, we're able to answer at least one of the questions that we ask ourselves in trying to determine what the elements of the offense are. Okay, and that first question, of course, is who is the offender, who is liable for the act. Second question is, what is that act that this person or this offender would be liable for? Okay, and if that act by itself is not conclusively, unlawful, or by itself it's not unlawful, what would make it unlawful? That's the third question. So let's see if we can answer those three questions from this clause. We can see that the first one is answered, the question of who the offender is. It says any person, but it's qualified by natural or juridical. So really the answer there to that first question is any natural or juridical person. So the question, if you don't know, or the next logical question, if you don't know, is what is the difference between a natural or juridical person? Okay, well, a natural person is just like it's you and I. Any human, any real person, okay, is a natural person. Okay, we have rights, that obviously need to be protected. Okay, so those are the qualities or the benefits, if you will, of being a natural person, right? A juridical person is a person obviously not natural, but one that is created by law. Okay, and the more obvious manifestation of that would be a corporation. Okay, they're created by law. Okay, and they refer to them as persons because they're also entitled to rights that need to be protected. Okay, so here the clause refers to any person, and it makes it clear that when it says any, it's referring to both types of persons that have rights that must be protected. So that's natural persons, that's like you and I, real humans, and juridical persons, corporations and the like. All right, any entity that's created by law. Okay, so yeah, any natural or juridical person. That's essentially our answer to the first question. And then second question is, what is the act? And this is where it gets a little complicated because if you let's go ahead and just go ahead and annotate para mas madali. So as I said, this is, in answering the second question of what the act or omission is, medyo nagiging complicated kasi this clause or this provision says who shall violate any of the provisions of this act or any rule or regulation promulgated by the authority or by the LLDA. Okay, so what this is really telling us is the law says, hindi ko sasabihin sa'yo kung ano yung offense. Okay? Kailangan mong i-research pa. Okay? You have to look at a different source or other sources besides this or as an alternative to this provision. Kasi this provision not only tells us who the offender might be, but it gives instructions that you're not going to find it here in this provision. You have to look elsewhere. And the elsewhere here really is other provisions of this law, of the Laguna Lake Development Authority Act, as well as other rules or regulations that may be promulgated by the LLDA in pursuance to this clause, Section 39A. Okay? So, if we were to look at the provisions of the LLDA Act, this law that we're talking about, dahil it really focuses on creating the LLDA. So it talks about what kind of an entity it is. Again, it says it's a quasi-government agency. Okay? It also talks about its powers, duties, and functions. Okay, so yun ang tutok niya. And at the moment, we're not gonna find, if there's even any actually, we're not gonna find any specific provision that talks of a rule or regulation that people must abide by when they're in the Laguna Lake region. Okay? And being that that's the case, we'll have to look elsewhere. Okay? Although okay na rin na nandyan siya because this, the provision that says, look here at this law. Kasi who knows, maybe at some point in time in the future, baka, the law may get amended and it may get added. So keep that in mind. So when you're a environmental law enforcer and let's say you're given a jurisdiction involving the Laguna Lake region, then when you're trying to determine if a particular violation was committed, you'll also need to look into the Laguna Lake Development Authority Act to see if there's anything there, anything new that would constitute an offense. Being there is none at the moment, if there's really none, okay, and from what I've seen there is none, okay, then it would make sense to look at the other sources. The other sources here, as the law provides, is rules or regulations promulgated by the LLDA. Okay. Now, the LLDA, as we said, is a quasi-government agency. And as a quasi-government agency, it has proprietary functions. In essence, it is a corporation. And as a corporation, it follows the standards of how a corporation does business. So when it makes certain announcements and promulgations of rules or anything like that, it's usually done through board resolutions. So no different here. What we're gonna find, where we would find these offenses would be in board resolutions. Okay, but anyway, before we proceed on to the board resolutions, let's see if we could just quickly put this on our worksheet. And we can sort of, as we've seen, we could only identify who the offender might be, who would be liable. Okay, so it's any natural or juridical person as to the act or omission. We don't know yet. We'll have to look at the board resolutions. Okay. All right. So let's proceed on. Board resolutions. But just keep in mind, it's not just board resolutions. The IRR may also provide, but probably most are found on board resolutions. So let's take a look at board resolutions. Okay, like in any organization or entity these days, the first place that we would start in our search for answers would probably be the website, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at the LLDA website, and in that website we do see that they are publishing their board resolutions online, and we can find them under the e-library tab, under which is the laws and policies menu option, which if we choose it, we'll find two options: the implemented laws, which interestingly enough you could reference that because it contains all of the pertinent laws, including the LLDA Act. Okay, so it's there. It's also a good place to go if you want to know if there's been any changes to these laws, any amendments, because they would surely post it there. Okay, so implemented laws, but our focus is board resolutions, so we're going to pick that options, board resolutions. And in picking that, we're going to find essentially all board resolutions that the LLDA board would publish. And of course, it's not limited to the offenses, or to a resolution that talks about offenses. That means we'll have to sift through the board resolutions that it publishes to identify which specific board resolutions talk about offenses. Okay, and for this presentation I did find one that I'm going to use, and I'm going to pull it up here for you. Okay, here it is. It's one of the board resolutions, and in this one there are a number of violations that are listed. So if we're to look at a couple of them, let's look at the first one. We'll see already that it gives us the answer to our question as to what acts would constitute an offense. Okay, so here let's read it. Operating emission sources installation without a permit to operate ESI, or discharging wastewater without a discharge permit. So there's technically dalawa yung there's two acts in the alternative. So the first act is operating emission sources, and the second is discharging wastewater. So we know, let's go ahead and pull that up on our worksheet. We know exactly who the offender is because as a default, the LLDA Act tells us that it's any natural or juridical person. So that's what we're going to identify as our answer to our first question. And that's because also it's not otherwise stated in this board resolution. So keep that in mind. There may be instances where the board resolution would either qualify or add or change as to who might be liable. Okay, but this one makes no mention of anyone else, so we're going to default to what was said by the LLDA Act. Okay, and that's any natural or juridical person. So back to the acts. Like I said, there's two that are identified here, but we'll focus on the first. The first act is operating emission sources installation. Okay, and we also know that by itself, okay, it's not necessarily unlawful unless it is done without a permit to operate. Okay, so that is the qualifier. So there you see that the act is operating emission source installation, and it becomes unlawful and a violation of this provision when it is done without a permit to operate ESI. The second act that we're seeing here is the act of discharging wastewater. The act of discharging wastewater is not necessarily unlawful, but it is when it is done without a discharge permit. By the way, this is an example of the pollution abatement that we talked about some minutes ago. There's clearly a need for a permit before anyone could discharge wastewater into the Laguna Lake. So wastewater, of course, is, for example, yung pinaghugasan natin ng pinggan, pinaghugasan natin ng kotse, that sort of thing. Okay, but I think it's also important to note that we have to look at a different, because it's not here. We'll have to look at maybe in one of the resolutions as to the legal definition of wastewater. Okay, we may need to do that because there may be certain, because I cited some basic examples of what I personally consider wastewater, di ba? But it may not necessarily be considered wastewater in the definition of law that would constitute a violation of this offense. So we have to remember, as investigators or even prosecutors, we have to make sure that whatever facts we're presented with that says it's wastewater that was discharged, that wastewater that's defined in those facts are the same wastewater that are within the definition of wastewater as defined in this law. So we have to remember to do that. Okay, that's just another tip. All right. So anyway, for this particular violation, again, we're seeing 2 acts with qualifiers. All right, and I think I have a second one here, which also presents a similar circumstance to what I just moments ago talked about. And this one, the act here is constructing, operating fish pen in excess of the allowable allocated area. So before we discuss this provision or this offense, let's just quickly pull it up on our worksheet first. All right, so offender is as indicated made default in section 39A of the LLDA Act, and that's any person, any natural or juridical person. The act or omission is that of constructing or operating a fish pen, and the qualifier is that it is in excess of the allowable or in excess of the allocated area. Okay, so that's the qualifier. All right, so now let's discuss this. If you were to read this, surely you'll be able to quickly see that there's a kind of a gray area, okay, specifically on the qualifier. What is considered in excess of what is allowed, okay, or what is allocated? What is, in my opinion, is not excessive may be excessive to you, right? And may be different with another person. So here there is a need to clarify what is allowable and what is allocated area. Okay, so this provision by itself is not conclusive. It doesn't say quite just yet how this becomes unlawful. Okay, it just says that it's in excess of the allowable or in excess of the allocated area. Okay, we still need to determine what is allowable and what is allocated, and surely that is something that would be found somewhere in any of the provisions of law, whether it's on the LLDA Act, perhaps in the definition of terms, or in maybe in some of the other provisions in that law, or it could be in another board resolution. Okay, but again, as it is, this provision by itself is not conclusive to tell you when this is an unlawful act, when constructing and operating a fish pen is considered an unlawful act. Okay, so you still have to do that extra research. All right, so anyway, that's pretty much it. The rest I think I will just leave to you, as I have done with the other provisions from other lessons. I will leave to you. I'd like to encourage you to do your own research, your own exercises. Search the LLDA website for other resolutions that may provide offenses. Look at how it's defined, break it out, identify the elements, and see if there are any other issues like the one that we are just discussing now that may need additional references, and see if you can find those answers. I think this would be a good exercise to help you on your journey, to hone your skills and allow you to be able to quickly ascertain when a violation is present before you. Okay, whether it's through evidence that's provided to you or just maybe you've witnessed it yourself. Okay, so that being said, we are actually done now at this point. We're essentially with lesson 2, and since lesson 2 is the last lesson on blue laws, it also means that we are done with blue laws. So with that said, I'm gonna say goodbye for now, and I will look forward to another talk with you on the next module, which is on brown laws. Until then,